great to have you all here. It's great to be back at Cologne. This is the first time actually since 2020 or 2019 that I'm among humans giving a presentation. Usually it's always at home doing it via Zoom. So thanks for showing up. And as mentioned, this is my third Gamescom, and I seem to come here at pivotal stages in my career, which I will talk about in my next slide. And the first time I was at Gamescom was actually exactly 9 years ago when we were here with the BioWare Edmonton team to present Dragon Age Inquisition. The second time was in 2019 when I was here with EA to talk about the inclusive design framework and inclusion framework for the very first time in public. And I can imagine that the description of the DevCom talk may have sounded a bit cryptic or maybe a bit complicated or interesting. So thank you for coming to the talk. I hope it will be fun, interactive, and you will take something out of the talk. I hope we can engage in conversations afterwards as well. The talk will be about 35 minutes, and I'll be here to answer questions, and I'll be hanging out outside if you want to talk as well. My name is Tulay McNally. Before we actually dive into the topic, let me talk a little bit more about who I am. As mentioned, I was born in Munich, Germany, as you can hear from my accent, 48 years ago, to Turkish parents. Diving into my career trajectory, I got my master's degree in American Studies or Amerikanische Kulturgeschichte at Ludwig-Maximilians University, and with a minor in psychology and history of science and technology. And my master thesis is what actually got me into CGI and the creative entertainment industry, because I wrote about the impact of CGI on the storytelling of Hollywood films, like why is there a CG Jabba the Hutt in a special edition Star Wars, for example. So some of those things, which landed me my first job as an editor at print publishing called Digital Production. And from there I moved to Montreal in Canada, Quebec, where I worked for Alias Wavefront, which is the maker of Maya 3D software. I worked for a CG artist community website, CG Channel, as an editor. And eventually in 2006, I decided I would like to pursue my passion for gaming. And at that time, I was playing a lot of first-person shooters like Counter-Strike. But ironically, my first full-time career gig took me to RPGs, which were Square Enix and even at Sega. When I worked in localization primarily, I was working on RPGs. And in 2010, I joined the EA family, more specifically BioWare. I moved to Edmonton in Canada to head up the QA teams in Edmonton and Montreal for Dragon Age and Mass Effect franchises. And later on, took on central development services, as we call them, which were including all the publishing-related activities across Montreal, Austin, and Edmonton. And Dragon Age and Mass Effect are still some of my favorite franchises, so that was pretty exciting to be part of those games. 5 years ago, I moved back to Europe, which was interesting because I felt like I was very North Americanized, and now coming back, especially to Sweden, which was very socialist, egalitarian society, was interesting, and lots of interesting things I've learned also about myself and my management style, comparing both cultures. And I ended up in Stockholm, where I joined DICE, FPS finally, as a senior development director, and my job was focusing on process improvements on the studio side, studio culture, people management, and how we can improve those things. And this is where I got involved in something called the inclusion framework. I see Lisa here from Ubisoft. So we are both veterans of the original inclusion framework, where we have applied certain principles we have discovered onto the development process, how to make our games more representative of audiences today and what they want with intent. I've done a lot of talks about inclusion frameworks, so not going into detail on that. So if you go on my website, you can see plenty of talks I have done there. Plus, I don't work for EA anymore, so I don't want to talk too much about the inclusion framework at EA. But I would like to talk about what I do today, and maybe a little bit how I really got into this job as well. Because the work with inclusion framework was really a voluntary work. We were doing that all on top of the day job that we had. And then in 2020, when a lot of pivotal things happened in the world, including the George Floyd murder and pandemic and everything else, I felt like it's really a moment where we need to make a stand and really say that this is something we need to dedicate a full-time person for. So I made a pitch to the COO at that time, Laura Miele, and I became the first director of inclusive design and development at EA to really build a strategy. And after 3 years, I always said, once I fulfill my 3-year strategy, I will fire myself. So I left after 3 years and 13 years at Electronic Arts. And I'm currently writing a book about equitable design. I'm working as a freelance coach focusing on career development. And I'm also volunteering with a LGBTQ plus activist company or a company or organization, a non-profit that is focusing on supporting LGBTQ plus professionals in the UK, called Out Making Games. So that's what I do today. So since my days at BioWare, I have developed a very keen interest in building the right environment for my teams, and not just the teams that report to me, but our developers in the studio in general. And even after all of those years, I still remember BioWare's mission and vision statement, which today is different, but the one that we had then still is very much burned into my memory, which was quality in the workplace and quality in our products in the context of humility and integrity. And this mantra has really stuck with me throughout my entire career, because in an ideal scenario, magic happens if you can bring all of those things together in the right balance at the right time. And today's theme is about how a holistic approach to a belonging culture can accelerate inclusion, innovation in your business. And while this sounds maybe intimidating and a little bit complicated, it really isn't. And I've tried through a lot of research and a lot of time thinking about this to simplify some of the critical concepts so it doesn't feel like trying to find the unicorn. So please join me in exploring over the next few minutes key frameworks and concepts originating in organizational psychology, but that I'm trying to apply to game development. In my spare time, I like to mentor. And one of my mentees, or a question that I'm often getting asked from my mentees is, what was the most memorable game that you have worked on? Or what was the best game that you have worked on? And without hesitation, my answer is always the same, which is Dragon Age Inquisition, which is a fantasy RPG developed by BioWare. And my answer, though, made me pause for a second because the development of Dragon Age Inquisition was not easy at all. And with most games and projects, and you probably know that all yourself, there are good and there are bad times. But what made this project special was, among many other things, our shared passion and belief in the game's vision, and that we had something special at our hands. And that was the first time when I started wondering whether a team's culture and their team's health corresponded with the game's quality and the player experience is eventually something like a Metacritic score. So I started observing my theory from then over several projects that I was attached to in my career and tried to visualize that hypothesis, which is this. And the idea behind this theory was that a team's engagement score could predict a game's Metacritic. So a team engagement, some people call it a team health or happiness or satisfaction. They all consist of a set of, for example, weighted questions. And if you divide the total number of questions and total points reached and multiply that by 100, you'll get a percentage, with 0% being the lowest and 100% being optimal. In reality, I have never seen a 100% team engagement score. But if you have something that is above 70, it's pretty okay. If you're something above 80, it's pretty good. And there are, of course, a wide range of different kinds of metrics you can use, and a few options are listed on the link here at the bottom right. But you can also Google that pretty easily. And the theory was that if employees feel that their basic needs are fulfilled, like pay and benefits, they can produce a playable, okay game. For example, your 70 team health score or 75 Metacritic, and suppose they also believe in the game's vision and feel passion for their work in combination with psychological safety, in that case, they can create great immersive experiences, which often lands in the 80 plus Metacritic range. And then in combination with innovation, innovative features, when you and your players can build an emotional connection with your product or your brand, you have a hit on your hands and magic happens. Over the past years, I've been observing whether my hypothesis had any substance. And the following slides are an illustration of the evolution of that hypothesis and things I have found out along the way. And the pyramid visualization may be familiar to you because it's inspired by Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a motivational theory comprising of 5-tier model of human needs that I often depict in an image of a pyramid. And Maslow's studies explored the human potential and how we can fulfill that potential. So Maslow's theory was that growth needs do not stem from a lack of something, but rather from the desire to grow as a person. And once these growth needs are reasonably satisfied, one may reach the highest level called self-actualization. And the visualization in a pyramid is often chosen because it's easy to follow. It's simple to put together in an image. However, the order is not necessarily rigid, but maybe flexible based on things like your external circumstances, cultural context, like where you grew up, where you live, or individual differences. I have seen the pyramid often also depicted in waves, which you can see on the right image. And it shows that hierarchy of needs is not like a video game where you fulfill the first level and then you move up to the next level of the pyramid, or you don't have to fulfill the first one to progress to the next one. It rather tries to depict that these needs happen simultaneously. And for example, a person may be motivated by higher growth needs, but at the same time, they may have lower level deficiency needs they want to see fulfilled. So in the work that I have done with game teams in the context of team culture and inclusive player experiences, my observation was that in team engagement or team health surveys, the question or the topic of esteem and belonging, which are here under psychological needs, are often the hardest to achieve and reach, and also the hardest to understand. And so let's dive into that a bit more. The concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion has its roots in the introduction of equal employment rights and affirmative action in the mid-60s. In the US, it was heavily influenced and spearheaded by the US civil rights movement, for example. And in the past, it has focused on the things you can see with your eyes, like gender, race, disability. But today, it also includes other identities. We will talk about that a bit in a bit. But also, if you, like me, go on social media sites like LinkedIn, for example, you will see a lot of acronyms popping up, which might be difficult to keep up what all these 3 or 4 letter words mean. There's, for example, DEIA, with the A standing for access or accessibility. Then there's DEIB, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And there's also a term called JEDI, where we bring in social justice, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it can get very quickly very, very overwhelming to keep up. However, there's something in the word belonging that really caught my eye because I could relate that back to the hierarchy of needs. So I started looking a bit more into the belonging part. Oftentimes, belonging is described as the intersection between DEI and engagement. And many DEI efforts need to catch up or be faster to develop because hitting that belonging mark is hard. And even if you have things like workforce diversity, even if you treat your employees fairly or you include them in decisions. So studies have shown, such as the one from Google, which is here at the bottom left, that belonging is among one of the most powerful predictors of DEI efficacy in the workforce. When employees feel that they genuinely belong at work, they feel more connected, they feel more committed. And how people feel and whether they feel they belong is truly a key DEI indicator for connection. And many of us probably felt most of these feelings over the 2 pandemic years, where working remotely may have increased your need for connection or feeling accepted. And this is probably likely where many games with solid social features were also booming so much. So if you have team engagement surveys, for example, how about adding a measure for belonging in your engagement survey that is also looking at it from a demographic perspective and not just like general belonging? So rather than looking at the overall engagement or belonging scores, which is most commonly done, maybe you could dig into that also from a demographic perspective to see if you truly have a DEI problem or not. And you can also relate that easily to the player engagement and perspective as well, when you can see many parallels to this approach through user research, for example, because players are human after all, and developers are human too. So typically, the belonging question in HR is very simple, which is, do you feel like you belong on your team or the company? But if you don't really understand what belonging means in the first place, how do you answer that question? So let's talk a little bit more about belonging, or in German Zugehörigkeitsgefühl. So the definition of belonging, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a feeling of being happy or comfortable as part of a particular group and having a good relationship with the other members of the group because they welcome you and accept you. It's a sense of belonging is one of humanity's most basic needs. So belonging and inclusion are critical psychological needs in the hierarchy of human needs. So what are the things that you can do to really get to that sense of belonging? So some of the things you can do is focusing on psychological safety, for example. You can be an ally, especially with underrepresented groups. You can show your support. It can be extremely powerful, especially if you're a senior leader, just to reach out to people who are maybe not just your direct reports, but people beyond your direct reports, and check in with them, ask them how they're doing. If you're working in an office, walk past their office and just like check how people are doing. It can be especially important in hybrid or remote environments. And it also shows your people that they matter and they matter to you. Give people a voice, especially those from underrepresented communities who may not feel empowered to speak up. For example, if you're in a meeting, you see people continuously maybe wanting to speak up or not speaking up because they're too shy. Maybe you can encourage them or help them and talk to them as well. The easiest way to know what you need to do is to ask, talk to people. That's really the most simple thing. I know surveys are good, but surveys can also be a bit one-dimensional or just very one-way. So I would encourage you to speak in your one-to-ones with people, have those conversations, maybe in team meetings, and explore ways how to improve and promote inclusion and belonging on your teams. And just like with gaming communities, you can also encourage your employees to organize, self-organize in self-organized employee communities, such as employee resource groups, or some people call them wellness groups, because it can be a pretty powerful tool to foster a sense of belonging and connection. And it can also feel good to know that you don't feel alone. You have a community of like-minded people, or people who maybe share common concerns and challenges. And now with all that said, you can also really easily connect that back with your players. For example, by building safe platforms where your players interact or pursue self-expression respectfully without being harassed by other people. Or you can show your support for the needs your players have or they raise, for example, by traditionally overlooked and marginalized players. You can take representation and cultural sensitivity and accessibility seriously and do something about it with intent. You can also give your players, especially those from underrepresented communities, a voice to give you feedback on this matter and do targeted service through user research, for example, or interviews, community interactions through social media or conferences like Gamescom. And you can also encourage your underrepresented employees to give you feedback. I think that's where employee resource groups can be powerful, to give you feedback about how your games are doing and how they can be improved. Convincing business leaders to prioritize inclusion often requires a blend of ethical considerations and tangible business benefits, essentially budget. And 2 years ago, a marketing insights company called Newzoo, the link, or you can Google that on the bottom left. They've done a study about inclusion in gaming, which is pretty comprehensive if you can download the entire PDF. And this survey was run across the UK and the US. And the key results were that players who want to see more diverse characters in games, and they feel they want to see them because they are meant for them. And remember, in the end, you're not making games for yourself, you're making games for other people. And we shouldn't be only thinking about the needs of our players that we have today, but the players that we want to have in the future to grow our current player base, and think about the players that we're not even reaching because of things that we haven't considered yet. Because there could be a variety of things that come into play. And some of these things can be as simple as your game is not culturalized or localized in a particular territory where it could be successful. Or women, for example, still play a lot on mobile, more on mobile than on console, but they also play more on console than on PC. So opening up your game to different platforms can open up opportunities to reach more players, for example. And if we want to expand the reach of our games, we need to start exploring also diverse ideas and diverse stories. And to do that, we need to implement systems and structures that enable this from a production perspective and from community management and also from HR. So what is valid for players is equally valid for those who make games, us developers. And I have experienced firsthand by talking to our fans and players from Dragon Age and conferences, what a powerful experience it can be when you feel connected with your players and you can see what a positive impact your game can have on their life. And players can develop a much stronger sense of community and feel connected to your brand with more representation. And the same goes for us as employees. I want to talk a bit about icebergs and how inclusion can accelerate innovation. And to explain this concept, I like to use the concept of an iceberg. You may hear this as a cultural iceberg. I call it the diversity iceberg. And the main idea behind the iceberg model is that in the same way as a real iceberg, with any culture, there are obvious things such as visible behaviors that you can see, but there are a lot of things that are hidden behind the surface that you can't see within a group or a company, an organization, which are driving certain behaviors. And this early awareness and training in the inclusion, diversity, equity, inclusion space was mostly focusing on the things that are visible above the line. But today we are trying to see the person as a whole, which also includes a lot of the things that you don't always see at first sight, which are here in the light purple, pink font, which drive the whole person. And the critical message or the point of the iceberg is that the core of our identity is made up of many different dimensions that exist below the surface that you cannot see. And these are buried qualities that are critical to our individuality and that provides the essence of diversity. And this is an important fact to remember as we think about the games we make as well and who we make them for. So the research from Newzoo and other research show that players want more diversity and they want to be seen, they want to be acknowledged by us, and they want to see that through authentic and believable characters and stories. And by that, I mean characters and stories that don't fall into stereotypes or tropes. Characters and stories that feel authentic and where inclusion and cultural sensitivity is approached with intent and respectfully. The creative conflict can drive innovation, but for creative conflict to drive innovation, we also need thinking partners that are different from ourselves. We need people of different backgrounds and experiences to think together with us. And the best approach, especially in our creative industry, is to stay open-minded and curious and consider other cultures and norms and constraints and being mindful of our own expectations, which is often influenced by our own cultural background, our experiences, our parents, our context. And as many of you also know, there are many different types of biases, and there's lots of training out there that you can take about exploring things like your thinking bias or confirmation bias or behavioral biases such as optimism bias or overconfidence. And these biases can often lead us to overlook essential risks, especially if we believe we are dealing with a familiar situation. And it's also easier to see biases in other people than in yourself, which means we need to improve our awareness or self-awareness and skills to give and also receive feedback. And in that context, it's often best to bring other people, diverse voices to the table and to listen to them. And that can be a broader, diverse employee base or your players. And also, if you want to learn more about bias, I think there's Celia Hoodent here as well. She's done a lot of really great trainings about that and also wrote some great books. But user researchers are really your friends and allies here, so I highly recommend you to reach out to UXR people. However, some questions you can also ask yourself are pretty simple. So, for example, how is what we do inclusive? How are we going to deal with different opinions? Whose perspectives are we missing? And this is not to blame anyone or call anyone out, but it's more intended to really encourage the question of where do we actually go from here? So when I worked at DICE in Sweden on studio culture and people management initiatives, our HR team organized a training about psychological safety. And this is when I was introduced to the SCARF model. And I really love that concept because it made understanding reasons for things like fight and flight reactions or triggers a lot more straightforward and easy to understand. And looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it made me think that it's really a good way to describe how one can move from, if you're stagnating at the basic needs, meeting the basic needs from an organizational perspective, to moving forward to fulfilling your employee psychological needs and eventually the emotional needs. So the SCARF model was developed in 2008 by David Rock. The model is based on neuroscience research that implies that these 5 social domains, SCARF, activates the same threat and reward responses in our brains that we rely on for physical survival. And the SCARF model represents these 5 areas influencing human behavior. And the human brain wants to minimize dangerous events, and they want to maximize reward, which activates respective responses. And it also explains and helps to deal with human reactions, motivations, and interactions. So to explain the meaning behind these letters a bit more is a positive example for status would be positive or bidirectional feedback. And bidirectional, I mean your manager gives you feedback, but they also invite you to give your manager feedback. Public acknowledgement. And on the contrary, it would be a passive-aggressive critique or unsolicited advice, for example, that would cause an opposite reaction. A positive example for certainty would be a team has clear, achievable goals and clear expectations and feasible work schedules. An anti-example would be there's no transparent decision-making or communication of that, or it's very distant or corporate, and the decisions are unpredictable, and the behaviors of your team members or worse, your studio leadership is unpredictable. The providing choice, self-organization of teams and empowerment can support your needs for autonomy. While micromanagement and a command and control leadership where you're telling people what to do without inviting them to give you feedback or ask questions can do exactly the opposite and feel diminishing. You can achieve relatedness by focusing on mutual support through things like mentorship, learning programs, and providing your teams with opportunities to socialize. And you can have the opposite effect if you promote unhealthy internal competition between teams, or you kind of put them up against each other, or socialization is not allowed at all, which has happened to me long time ago, but it happens. And fairness can be supported through transparent decision-making, communication, and clear team rules. And if you create unequal conditions, lack of rules, processes, essentially chaos, or no communication on the decisions you make, for example, you won't get very far. And while the SCARF model is typically seen as an HR tool, and it originates in organizational psychology, you can also see how you can easily apply this back to your engagements and interactions with the player communities and how they interact with your community or interact with your brand or your franchise. And it all impacts engagement and a sense of belonging. Yet another concept, but bear with me. We discussed earlier that self-actualization in the hierarchy of needs as an individual or creative freedom and self-expression from a player or developer perspective is the ultimate quest. It's our ikigai. Ikigai is a Japanese concept that describes the reason for being, while iki in Japanese means life, and gai describes the value or worth. And your ikigai is essentially your life's purpose, your bliss. And the image of ikigai illustrates 4 questions that give us the reason to get up in the morning. So the practical part of ikigai is about what we need to make a living or to survive, and what does the world need. And the challenge here is to combine those things that are fundamental with whatever it is for you, with what you love and what you're good at. And it happens that people form their values early on in their life, for example, through their parents or their background, their culture, where they grew up. And we usually don't really give it much thought what our values and beliefs are until we face maybe an internal crisis or dilemma or don't know kind of what's wrong in this situation. And sometimes it can happen throughout our career, also as we age, that there's a mismatch of maybe the default values and goals or beliefs and our actual thoughts and feelings and experiences. That's when we start maybe thinking a bit more time about how we live is aligned with who we are. Many of us may have experienced that also during the pandemic, where you're maybe questioning some of those things a bit more. And by now, I hope you have realized that this topic is very complex, and that there's no silver bullet or no shortcuts to success. As you know, it's not a straight line. However, once you prioritize things like belonging and psychological safety, and you hopefully get it right, that magic can happen. So to bring this back into games and players, and I have listed a few games that I personally find very intriguing, and I chose them deliberately because of their great inclusive design and immersive storytelling elements. And I don't have any insights on the development team on Elden Ring or Baldur's Gate, but I do know obviously about Apex Legends and Sims because I worked at EA. And the key takeaway here is that I think that the concept of ikigai can also be applied on development and game studios as well. So what would an ikigai for game developers and studios be translated to in this context? Passion, what you love, could be crafting engaging gaming experiences and narratives. Vocation, what you're good at, would be producing high quality games and leveraging advanced technologies like AI, for example. Mission could be what does the world need? It's diverse representation in games, creating socially responsible content, fostering inclusive gaming communities, creating games that challenge stereotypes and promote empathy. Profession, what you can be paid for, working in a thriving industry that rewards innovation, originality, and resonance with diverse audiences. And by aligning all these elements, game developers and designers can achieve, hopefully, a fulfilling career that caters to their personal interests and skills and beliefs and contributes also positively to society and ensures economic well-being of the individual. So by embracing that ikigai model, companies can drive profit and purpose, ensuring sustainability and possibly impacting the gaming community in a positive way as well. So considering everything that we have looked at, I explored and learned about Maslow's work, my updated understanding of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and my original Scrappy pyramid. I wanted to create an updated version of it. And I came up with this. Since I have yet to think for a name of this, I call it Maslow's iceberg. And the list of things I put here on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, are not complete, but it's a good start, I think, to kick off a discussion with your teams. What I would love to try to explore is, for example, if the hearts would be Post-its, where would your employees put them, whether they are on the team side or on the product side? Where do they see the product? Where would your players put their heart sticky on this chart, for example? There are also commonly used frameworks like Quantic Foundry's player archetypes. Another step I could imagine is that depending on your player archetype and even where you are in your personal growth, things like your age, cultural background, and so on, all of those things can impact the emotional and also the psychological player experience and whether the game meets your need at that moment in your life. And I think it also fits well with the fact that more accurate representation of how Maslow's pyramid actually happening in the form of waves. And imagine each of these waves interacting with product features, because in reality, some of the waves will probably be stronger, and in other words, sometimes they may be softer or less active, depending on what the player wants or needs. Based on their needs at that moment, it's fluid. It's like waves. So coming towards the end, I tried to summarize a few key points that I'm hoping you can take away or maybe think about. There's hopefully more takeaways than these 7, but I'm also happy to chat a bit more about this. So key takeaways I say here with more representation, remember the diversity iceberg, players can develop a stronger sense of community and feel more connected with your brand and your franchise. Also consider measuring your team engagement levels on a regular basis and be equipped and ready to take action on the feedback you're getting. Also measure the engagement of your players on a regular basis if you're not already doing that. Consider questions assessing inclusion and belonging during your research sessions. Try to infuse some belonging questions in your team engagement survey as well. And then do number 2 and 3 on a regular interval. So if it's maybe on a company level, you can maybe do them twice a year and see how if you're moving forward or backwards. If you are on a team, maybe do them after each major milestone. And also be transparent about when the news are maybe not as good, and share your actions and show the data back to your people, what you're doing. Consider adopting something like a SCARF model or get some training for your people managers and focus on psychological safety with your dev teams and explore your relationship with your players in that context as well. There are no shortcuts to amazing. Success is not a straight line. And also inclusion, psychological safety is not just a manager's job or the leader's job, it's everyone's job. So just hiring one inclusion person and thinking, they'll do everything and solve all our things is not going to work. It's too much. So I think it has to be everyone's responsibility, just like with quality. And lastly, I think it could be interesting to have discussions about what is your ikigai. If you're even having discussions or thoughts about career development, what do you want to do next, or what engages you if you feel disengaged, it could be a good model to assess where you are personally, to see what your Northern Star is. And with that, last slide, thank you. You can go on my website, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll be around outside if you want to talk to me or ask any questions. I'm also writing a book about equitable design, and this topic is going to be in the book. It's not just about this topic, but if you also worked on Baldur's Gate 3 and you have any data on your teams, and HR allows you to talk about this, it would be great to have like some actual case studies from other companies to kind of maybe give us some input to further this theory. So thank you very much for coming to my talk. Uh, mm, mm. So you mean how is this thinking scalable from big to small teams? I think that's a good question. I mean, obviously, with my background, I've mainly worked on really large teams, um, but I also know people who have worked on very small teams, like 20, 25 people. Um, and I think it kind of goes to the point of the overconfidence that I mentioned. Is like sometimes people maybe know each other, they have worked with each other for a long time, they form a new company, and then sometimes these cracks on the foundation happen because they think we don't really need to spend time on this. And I think um, my recommendation or my thinking would be um, not to take things for granted or things for given because you think you know things, but I think really trying to even be aware of these concepts and still trying to address them in things like your one-to-ones even and just like setting things like clear team vision, mission for your product, for your studio, and setting clear team rules. I think that will really help immensely when you're scaling regardless of your culture. I've seen that, for example, at BioWare when we had 3 studios and we had a very tight vision, mission, culture in Edmonton. How do you scale that or replicate what we had there in Edmonton and Montreal, where the culture is different? There's a different language. And in Austin, which is in America, and Texas and Canada is a bit different culturally as well. So how do you scale all of that? So I think just being really crisp on the vision and those what is important and what matters, but still allowing obviously your ecosystem in your local culture as well, and not be command and control and overbearing maybe with your corporate culture. But I think really focusing in on that crisp, clear direction and vision will really go a long way. And just like setting basic team rules, essentially defining what is the sandbox and what are the tools that we can use in the sandbox. And if people are not nice to each other, then we kick them out of the playground gently.